All right, so here I would like to talk about is unintended consequences of policies and the way that we actually set up our social systems. And in particular, I want to focus on the notion of how our homes shifted from being homes, shelter, places where we live and raise our families, to assets, and possibly they're on their way back. And for the purposes of this particular video, I'm simply going to assume that everything I'm going to report on is unintended consequence. To the degree to which it's an intended consequence of somebody's actions, it may very well be, but I don't care. All right, so I'm going to fast forward through the history of the Federal Reserve. But the key insight here is that the Federal Reserve, the way, or at least one of the principal ways that it tries to manage or modulate the economy is through interest rates. And the way that it modulates the economy through interest rates is that it changes the rate at which banks can borrow money. I'm simplifying, but I have to get this in place to kind of get to the next piece, which makes it possible to have more money come into the economy. And when banks can bring more money into the economy, there's more economic activity that can happen, that they can fuel. But here's the thing. Banks don't have direct access to the real economy, right? Banks don't buy widgets and they don't make cars. Banks loan money to people who do that kind of stuff. So when the Federal Reserve is trying to increase activity in the economy by lowering interest rates, what they're doing is they're pushing on banks to be able to produce more debt in the economy, to get more, to make more loans. All right. Fair enough. I'm not going to critique that just yet. We're just going to talk about the unintended consequences of that particular approach. So when you look at the debt market, the bond market in the economy, the biggest piece by far is U.S. Treasuries, but I'm going to rule that out because that's not productive. Well, I mean, in some sense, maybe it finances government activity, but I'm going to ignore that entirely. The other two big chunks are corporate and mortgage. In fact, mortgages is the bigger of those two. Right? So home loans. All right, so when the Fed is trying to get money into the economy and it's telling banks, okay, money is cheaper for you to make available, loan money out into the market, mark it up a bit and loan it back out. One of the biggest funnels that they can put that money into is in home loans. So they do, right? Because there's only so many bankers and they can only cut so many deals, and they can't, they just have to be able to figure out what are the biggest chunks of the economy that they can actually modify and interact with. By the way, on the corporate side, this will typically show up in things like large structured finance for MBO, for buyouts and acquisitions, which is one of the reasons why another unintended consequence is consolidation. It's just easier to write $1 billion check to get a big company to buy another big company than it is to try to write like $1 billion $1 checks to a whole bunch of guys who are trying to start up their own pizza stands. Okay, so mortgages. So now you have this notion, a need to move money into the economy by promoting mortgages, which of course is about basically getting one agent, a person, a home buyer, to be able to be financed to be able to buy a home, which of course then puts money in the hands of the home seller, who then, in principle at least, re-injects it back into the economy in some fashion, although of course many of them buy new houses, which doesn't really have a whole lot of impact on the real economy. But a characteristic of this is that it increases the price of homes. Right? You have this process where the need to inject money into the real economy has as a consequence that it causes there to be more money chasing after what is more or less a relatively inflexible supply of homes. Not always, obviously, construction can happen and does happen for sure, but it tends to increase the price of homes. Okay. So here's the next piece. When you've got a long enough period of time where that policy has been in place, that the price of homes has a very standard characteristic of up and to the right, which is to say it becomes part of the zeitgeist, part of the unassumed assumptions that mortgage prices are relatively stable and slightly accretive, because we've actually been creating an artificial vector of driving pressure, because that's the vector that we have for putting money into the economy. Then you get a secondary consequence, which is that mortgages, and in particular mortgage-backed securities, begin to be taken as relatively risk-free. You begin to assume that this condition that you've been seeing for a long period of time is a natural condition of the universe and think it's a solid foundation, when in fact, to some extent, it's an artifact of an unintended consequence of one of our mechanisms. Um, of managing the economy, of the way that we designed that. If the Fed had been designed a different way, if the Fed had the ability to say, for example, deliver UBI directly to people, as opposed to trying to moderate things through banks, they would have a different set of unintended consequences, but not that one. It's a little bit more esoteric. Let's take a look at two forks on this road. Um, as mortgages, in particular mortgage-backed securities, become seen as relatively risk-free, they also then become really high quality collateral. So if I'm trying to engage in large transactions, one of the things that I might do is I might hold mortgage-backed securities, and then I will use them as collateral so I get debt leverage, right? If I've got $1 million of mortgage securities and I go to the bank and say, hey, I'd like a loan backed by this as collateral, they might say, great, I'll give you $3 million for that, with that as collateral. So now I've got $3 million to work with. And of course, in particular, if I use that $3 million to go out and buy more property, then that actually becomes an asset that I could pump back in as collateral. So I get a feedback loop where the ability to take this asset as a super high quality, low risk asset creates a capacity to actually generate more leverage, which actually, by the way, injects more risk into the system, but it's risk that you don't see because it's tapped to that asset. And this is, of course, the story of the movie The Big Short. We saw that happen in 2006, where mortgage prices kept going up because more money was pumped into the system. Originally, it was the Fed and lending rates, but then it actually was the fact that because mortgages were seen as a solid collateral, leverage was generated, but that leverage was then pumped back into the system. Well, of course, if I have $3 million and I use that $3 million to go out and buy more property, then the price of property goes up, which to some extent means the value of my collateral just went up. Certainly I can mark it that way. I used to have $1 million worth of property, but now it's worth 1.5 million because the price of property is going up, guys. Come on, my collateral is worth more, so now I can borrow more, so now I can invest more, so now I can borrow more. You get a feedback loop where this happens, and this in fact actually did happen. Right? So that's one secondary consequence. So let's now go to a tertiary consequence, and I'll actually slide sideways after this to a kind of a fun ancillary tertiary consequence. Now, in this context, we're having this feedback loop where prices are going up and lending rates and leverage is being used. Then you get a competitive landscape because the bankers are competing to write loans. Like that's what they do. That's their product, right? Just like cell phone manufacturers compete to sell phones, banks compete to sell loans. And where there's a limited supply, like there's a lot of money that wants to get into writing loans, then what happens is they have to make better terms. And that a better term might be, for example, giving more leverage for less collateral. So instead of getting $3 million for $1 million in collateral, maybe I get 4 or 5 or 10, right? And at the peak of the 2006 financial bubble, leverage was starting to go through the roof, right? Because the more promiscuous bankers, the ones who are willing to write the fastest, hottest, cheapest loans, got more business and they made more money. Because of course they don't make their money on, particularly mortgage brokers, don't make their money on the return of the loans. They make their money on the cutting of the loan, the selling of the loan. Right? They just flip it and sell it to somebody else who packages it into a mortgage-backed security or to some other kind of object. So you create an economic system where there's a moral hazard, I believe is the term. Let's just call it promiscuity, becomes selected for. Now, of course, what that does is creates an accelerating price of the asset because there's just more money chasing what is now a very hard-strapped supply. You can try to, cranes everywhere trying to build buildings, but they can't keep up with the velocity of money because finance moves fast. Okay, so then what you do is you get this rapidly accelerating thing until something breaks at the top. Some small perturbation becomes more fragile, more susceptible to small perturbations because it's way out of where it skis in terms of leverage. And then somebody somewhere, some small shift in price goes down. Somebody misses a payment. There's bankruptcy. In the case of 2006, the lending terms just got so crazy that just couldn't make any sense, and something, small contraction in the economy cascades down and hits this thing. But then you have it's hyperfragile. The most promiscuous lenders are also the most vulnerable lenders. They're way out over their skis, and the borrowers are the most way over their skis. So if I'm at a 10-to-1 leverage and suddenly the value of my asset base just went down, the value of mortgage-backed securities went down a little tiny bit, well, my collateral just got worth less. So now I'm under collateralized. So now I have to sell some of my real asset, get enough collateral. Oh, well, shoot, that drives prices down. At the margin, just maybe like a tenth of a point. But now when this thing has become hyper efficient and hyper competitive, a tenth of a point makes a difference. That cascades down. Right? So that same steepness of ascent becomes a steepness of descent. Right? So a tertiary unintended consequence, you actually create vastly more volatile markets that have a characteristic of prices going way up and then having huge crashes when they fall. Now, let me slide sideways a bit because this is also very important, because in this process, when the value of an object, in this case a home, and the land it's sitting on, becomes financialized, it becomes an object of securities, and becomes something where money is moving meaningfully, significantly, it shifts in its meaning. It shifts from a home, it shifts from a thing that satisfies human needs, a place that keeps rain off your head and keeps you warm, to an asset. Right? It becomes a financial object. And that means people begin to think of it as a financial object. It's called wealth effects, right? If I can get people's homes to be more valuable, they feel like they're wealthier, which means, by the way, they'll be willing to spend more money. If I feel rich, I'm less worried about how much cash I have in the bank because I've got a $500,000 home. I'm rich. So fine, I'll spend more money. And so we saw that. We saw this notion of the wealth effects. And what's interesting is that we first noticed it, then we took advantage of it, then we got addicted to it. And we actually had to get people feeling more and more wealthy to keep that wealth effect tapped, to keep the flow of money going. And so then you get another negative feedback loop. If the price of the house starts to go down, not only do you start getting the debt side of the market evaporating, but also the wealth effect that you become so addicted to starts to evaporate, and velocity of money collapses. People are like, oh shit, I'm not rich anymore. Oh, and I've got no money in the bank. Oh fuck, I need to change my behavior, right? So you get a collapse on that direction. Then let's do another one. This other one's kind of funky. So let's say you're trying to be an educator and you're trying to make the educational system better. And let's say you've actually got a whole new way of testing, a new testing infrastructure that actually much more accurately evaluates the quality of education in an environment, how well people have learned, the quality of students. Let's say it's like a lot better, but it's different. So then you go to a school district and you say, hey, we'd like to give you this new methodology. We'll do it for free. We're awesome. And it's going to make it, you're going to do a better job at teaching. Your students will be smarter, more capable, and more effective contributors to society. Your tests will be more accurate. And they're like, that sounds awesome. So then start talking about it in the community. And some smart guy in the back, probably a mortgage broker, goes, what's this going to do to our existing test scores? You say, well, I mean, it's going to obsolete them. You're not going to need them anymore. They're useless. Our testing infrastructure is a lot better. And they go, yeah, but here's the thing. Real estate prices have a significant direct connection to test scores. If I've got two neighborhoods that are roughly equivalent in everything except for they broadcast, their local schools broadcast different qualities of test scores, then the one that has higher test scores has higher prices, more wealth. The houses are worth more. It's a better neighborhood because of that metric. And guess what you find really quick? Nobody's interested in buying your new technology. So a technology in the educational domain that should actually, by hypothesis at least, radically upgrade the quality of education can't get accepted because we've entrained our testing methodology to our home value methodology, and our whole fucking economy is now built on home values. So, and I don't mean just like the homeowners will get pissed if the home prices go down. The entire economy collapses because we're so premised on home prices being stably always going up. If we have a small shift in the price of homes, the lending market collapses because they become hyper fragile. The wealth effect goes down, and so the economy begins to shrink, and that collapses. So this crazy quaternary effect, you might call it, of the fact that we designed our system so the Federal Reserve tries to modify the economy by reducing interest rates, which increases induces banks to be more able and willing to loan money at a cheaper price, which causes more pressure to push money in. We only have a small number of large valves, corporate securities and mortgage securities to drop money into, which increases the price, the value, the amount of money chasing after homes, which increases the price of homes, which creates all these different secondary and tertiary side effects. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So, something to think about.